Welcome, dear listener, to the quiet lanes and gentle hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, where life proceeds at a deliberate English pace, until, of course, it doesn't. Today we join Miss Jane Marple in a most peculiar affair, one involving knitting, secrets, and a pattern far more dangerous than wool alone could suggest. Settle in with a cup of tea as we begin Miss Marple and the suspicious pattern. Chapter 1. A Curious Beginning at Weathervane Cottage. The morning sunlight of early April fell over St. Mary Mead in a soft, buttery wash, just warm enough to promise spring, yet still cool enough that the early risers clutched their shawls a little closer. The hedgerows wore the faintest green haze, as though some artistic hand had brushed the landscape lightly with watercolor. And in the middle of this charming village, prim, proper, and polite, Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her neat white cottage to take her morning walk. Walking was, to Miss Marple's mind, an indispensable part of daily life. It kept one healthy, of course, but more importantly, it kept one informed. A stroll down the high street at the right hour offered more intelligence about the life of St. Mary Mead than a week of reading the newspaper. Early morning was perfect, the baker's van rattling past, the postmistress sweeping her doorstep, the milkman delivering bottles with a clink like polite applause, and the sound, as faint as a whisper, of someone's wireless crackling with the BBC. On this morning, Miss Marple carried a small shopping basket over her arm, though she had no intention of filling it. The basket merely gave her respectable purpose, should anyone accuse her of taking an interest in matters that weren't strictly her concern. Jane Marple always smiled at that suggestion. In her experience, everything was always someone's concern if one simply observed long enough. She had not yet reached the turn that led to the church when she began to sense, with the finely tuned intuition of a woman who had spent her life noticing small things, that something was amiss. St. Mary Mead had a rhythm, a gentle, unhurried heartbeat, and this morning it stuttered. Here, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was speaking too quickly to Mrs. Bartlett. There, the young paper boy tore down the street with uncharacteristic urgency. And farther ahead, just beyond the high street, a small crowd had gathered around the gate of the old Weathervane cottage. Miss Marple paused. One did not often see a crowd in St. Mary Mead unless the vicar had done something quite shocking during a sermon, which was unlikely, or unless the butcher had announced a wartime shortage of something the villagers liked, which was even more unlikely these days. No. This kind of gathering was different. Curious faces, hushed whispers, people leaning ever so slightly forward as though afraid they might miss some crucial detail. It was the stance of villagers who had discovered a story, one they intended to repeat at least 6 times before luncheon. She approached with deliberate calm, her blue eyes bright beneath the brim of a simple straw hat. "Miss Marple," the familiar voice of Mrs. Prudence Harrowby, churchwarden and enthusiastic preserver of village gossip, rose above the murmurs. She beckoned with the imperious flap of her gloves. "Do come at once. Something rather dreadful has occurred." Miss Marple joined the crowd at the gate. "Nothing too dreadful, I hope." Mrs. Harrowby leaned in dramatically. "Mr. Lionel Bexley, the new resident, someone has broken into his cottage." A ripple of noise swept through the listeners. Shock, delight, speculation. St. Mary Mead rarely received excitement of this variety. Miss Marple looked toward the cottage. The old Weathervane cottage had always been one of the loveliest homes in the village. Ivy-blanketed walls, whitewashed windowsills, blue shutters that matched the little garden gate. The previous owner, Mrs. Tilling, had kept it spotless even into her late 80s, and since her passing it had sat empty until Mr. Bexley, a modest man in his mid-40s, had moved in only 3 months ago. Now the front door stood wide open. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "that is most unusual." Never in her life had she known the Tilling cottage to stand open like that, not even in heat waves, thunderstorms, or during the war when windows rattled in their frames with every distant explosion. Miss Marple stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was one of mild but deliberate chaos, not the careless work of a burglar hoping for valuables. No, this was quite different. Mr. Bexley's small writing desk had been overturned, a chair knocked aside, ink spilled across the floorboards in an inky constellation. A stack of papers lay strewn about like fallen leaves in a storm. And Mr. Bexley himself stood pale and trembling near the fireplace, his spectacles slightly askew. When he saw Miss Marple, relief softened his anxious expression. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness. These people are asking so many questions, I scarcely know how to answer." She offered a kind smile. "Well, if you feel up to it, perhaps you might simply tell us what happened?" Yes, of course, I had stepped out for a short walk, 15 minutes at most. When I returned, he gestured helplessly toward the scene. Miss Marple took in every detail with unhurried precision. Ink splatter too neat, papers scattered without any real rummaging. A vase knocked down but not broken, a window left open though the sill was spotless, no footprints, no disturbed dust. She had seen mischief before. This was posed. Her attention settled on something rather out of place on the writing desk, a small square of knitting, roughly 4 inches by 4 inches, made from thick wool in 2 distinct colors, green and gold. Neatly finished edges, precise stitchwork, intentional pattern. Miss Marple lifted it, delicately between finger and thumb. "Well," she said softly, "this is quite interesting." Mrs. Harrowby gasped dramatically. "A calling card! A criminal's calling card!" Miss Marple did not contradict her, yet. She ran her thumb over the pattern again. Garter stitch, alternating rows, but within it, a deliberate shift. A repeated geometric motif, almost like a signal or, no, not quite, but close. Before she could continue examining it, a cry from the kitchen broke the moment. Oh, sir, you're cordial." Everyone hurried to the kitchen doorway where Hazel Price, Mr. Bexley's young maid, stood with one hand over her mouth and the other pointing toward the counter. The glass bottle of cordial lay tipped on its side, its contents seeping into the wooden boards. The sharp, almost sickly sweet scent filled the room. Miss Marple inhaled slightly. Her brows rose. Laudanum. A faint smell, but unmistakable to anyone who had served patients, helped invalids, or grown old enough to recognize medicine by memory. Mrs. Harrowby clapped a hand dramatically on her chest. "Laudanum! But why?" Hazel stammered. "I didn't touch it, I swear. I was only doing the washing up, and then I saw the bottle spilled. Oh, please, sir, you must believe me." Miss Marple observed Hazel closely. The girl was pale, but her eyes darted not with guilt, but with genuine fear. Mr. Bexley raised his hands helplessly. "I don't understand any of this. Someone breaks in, overturns my desk, and now they meddle with my cordial?" Miss Marple returned her gaze to the knitted square. The stitches were calm, deliberate, utterly at odds with the chaos around them. But she said nothing yet. Villagers crowded in the doorway now, whispering fiercely. It must have been vagabonds, or someone from outside the village. No one from this village would do such a thing. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. The room quieted. "I wonder," she began in her gentle, thoughtful voice, "if perhaps we are looking at this the wrong way." Mrs. Harrowby blinked. "Wrong way? But there's been a break-in." "Has there?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Or rather, a performance." At this, several villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but Miss Marple had already moved toward the window, the one left wide open. Her fingers brushed the sill. No dirt disturbed, no paint scratched, no fingerprints visible, no smudges. A robber who climbed in or out would have surely left something behind. Still, the open window told a story, a false one. She reached down to the floor near the bed and picked up a folded scrap of paper. Not from the desk. No, this one bore faint creases as though it had been carried in a pocket for some time before being dropped. Hazel, still trembling, spoke in a small voice. "Miss Marple, do you think someone meant to harm Mr. Bexley? With the cordial, I mean?" Miss Marple tucked the knitted square gently into her basket. "My dear, I don't believe we have nearly enough information to begin guessing intentions." But her eyes said something else entirely. Because Miss Marple had known only one other occasion in her life when carefully knitted squares had been left at unusual places. They had been used during the war by clever women passing coded messages when the post was unreliable. Whoever left this square was not leaving a decoration. This was a message, and the overturned ink, the scattered papers, the spilled cordial, none of it rang true as genuine criminal activity. Someone had wanted a scene. Someone wanted attention placed squarely on the cottage and on Mr. Bexley. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought with a faint tightening in her chest, someone wanted certain things discovered before others. "Mr. Bexley," she asked quietly, "did you notice anything missing?" He looked around helplessly. "No. Everything important seems to be here." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to his writing desk. Papers disordered but nothing removed. The drawers not forced. The small lockbox beneath the desk untouched. Stranger still. Why break in to take nothing? Mrs. Harrowby cleared her throat, leaning forward. "Miss Marple, surely you have an opinion. You always do." A gentle smile crept across Miss Marple's lips. "Well, I have a few observations, certainly. But I find it best to refrain from conclusions until one is in possession of all the facts." The villagers sighed, collectively disappointed. Prudence Harrowby looked as though she might burst with impatience. But Miss Marple continued in that same soft, thoughtful tone. "For instance, I observe that the desk has been overturned, yet none of the fragile items, the porcelain figurine, the small clock, are broken. A clumsy burglar would never be so careful. I observe also that the window is open but unmarked, and that the scent of laudanum, while present, seems too faint for a recently spilled bottle. And finally," she held up the knitted square, "I observe that whoever left this behind did so quite deliberately." Mr. Bexley swallowed. "So, what does it mean?" Miss Marple studied him for a beat. "I don't yet know. But perhaps its meaning is not in the wool itself, but in the hand that made it." Prudence Harrowby pressed closer. "But who in the village knits in such odd colors, green and gold, and such strange stitching?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, many more people than you might think." Truthfully, she already had her suspicions, but suspicions were not evidence. She turned to Mr. Bexley. "For now, I should advise you to secure the remaining cordial and keep the cottage locked. I shall return later today if that suits." He nodded gratefully. "Please do. This is all rather unsettling." Miss Marple guided the crowd gently out of the cottage, ushering them back into the calm of the lane. As she stepped outside, the pale spring sun caught the knitted square in her basket, illuminating the green and gold wool like a small banner. The stitches formed a pattern, but an incomplete one, a beginning, and Miss Marple, who had solved far more complicated puzzles with far fewer clues, felt the unmistakable stirrings of a new mystery. Not a violent one, at least she hoped not, but certainly a curious one. She walked away from Weathervane Cottage with her usual unhurried grace, but inside her mind, sharp and keen as ever, threads began knitting themselves into possibilities. A staged break-in, a coded message in wool, laudanum on cordial, a nervous maid, a stranger with unknown purpose, and all of it beginning in the quietest village in England. Exactly where, Miss Marple often reflected, the most interesting things always happened. She paused at the corner, the breeze carrying the faint scent of blooming primroses. "Oh dear," she murmured to herself with mild amusement. "I do believe there's something quite suspicious woven into this pattern." And with that gentle remark, the mystery truly began. Chapter 2. Introductions and Intrigues in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple believed firmly that a mystery like a mislaid knitting needle was best approached not by fretting but by quietly, methodically examining one's surroundings. A good walk after an unsettling morning was precisely the thing to help one think clearly. And so, after leaving Mr. Bexley and the chattering villagers behind, she strolled along the lane that curved gently toward the high street, the green and gold knitted square tucked safely into her basket. St. Mary Mead looked as charming as ever, sunlight glinting on cottage windows, birds chattering with springtime enthusiasm, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Yet beneath the picturesque surface, Miss Marple sensed a tremor, something faint but persistent. It was like watching a pond ripple where no pebble had been thrown. Her first stop was the vicarage. It wasn't that she expected the vicar to have any thoughts about laudanum or coded knitting squares, but the vicarage offered vantage, quite literally, as its front garden overlooked much of the village. And more importantly, it offered Mrs. Griselda Clement. Miss Marple found the vicar's young wife standing among her rose bushes, pruning shears in hand, wearing an apron decorated with cheerful bluebells. Mrs. Griselda was, in Miss Marple's estimation, one of the most sensible women in the village, which did not mean she lacked spirit. On the contrary, Griselda possessed quite a lively mind, exactly the kind that could appreciate a curious puzzle when one presented itself. "My dear Miss Marple," Griselda called out as soon as she saw her, "I was just thinking how unusually excitable the village seemed this morning. Do tell me everything." The postmistress passed by, muttering something about laudanum and burglars, although one can never be sure with her whether she's speaking of real events or last week's detective serial. Miss Marple approached with a modest smile. "There has been an incident at Mr. Bexley's cottage. Nothing too dreadful, I hope, but certainly quite peculiar." Griselda waved the pruning shears with interest. "Peculiar is infinitely better than dreadful. Do sit down and tell me." They settled at the small wrought-iron table beneath a budding rose arch. Miss Marple recounted the scene: the overturned desk, the spilled cordial, the strangely tidy chaos, and, most importantly, the knitted square. Griselda examined the square with a raised eyebrow. "Good heavens! Who knits like this? The colors alone are alarming." "They are rather distinctive," Miss Marple agreed. "But the pattern is the most interesting part." Griselda traced the geometric motif with her finger. "It almost looks like some sort of, oh, what do the young call them, codes? Patterns for machines?" "Cipher patterns," Miss Marple supplied. "I thought the same." "But surely no one in St. Mary Mead is sending coded messages. What would they be about? The price of scones?" Miss Marple smiled. "You'd be surprised what people choose to conceal." Griselda's eyes sparkled with mischief. She had always adored a mystery, though she rarely admitted it aloud. "Well, we ought to consider who in the village knits. Let me think. Mrs. Weatherby does, but only in dreary grays. The church ladies knit for the soldiers, but they're all far too predictable. Mrs. Bartlett once tried knitting, but produced something that resembled a tea cozy meant to punish its user. No skill whatsoever." "And the younger women?" Miss Marple asked. Griselda laughed. "None have the patience, except perhaps the new tenant at Hillcrest Cottage, Mrs. Sylvia Merton. She moved here only a month ago, quite fashionable but prone to hobbies. She said she took up knitting during the war to steady her nerves." Miss Marple filed that away. Still, Griselda continued, this seems rather dramatic for a hobbyist. Which suggests purpose, Miss Marple murmured, and the break-in itself appears staged. Not a burglary, but rather a message. About what? That, Miss Marple said gently, is what I hope to learn. Before Griselda could reply, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. A tall, angular woman in a dove-gray coat marched toward them. Miss Lavinia Fawcett, the self-declared guardian of propriety in St. Mary Mead. Her nose was long, her eyebrows sharp, and her disapproval of the modern world practically audible. Miss Marple, she snapped without greeting, I hear you were at Mr. Bexley's cottage. Is it true he keeps laudanum? I always suspected him of being strange. Many respectable people keep laudanum, Miss Marple replied mildly. It is an old remedy, though one should use it sparingly. Old remedy indeed, Miss Fawcett sniffed. Mark my words. There is something not quite right about that man. Always scribbling away, shutting himself inside for hours. Writers are very dangerous people, I've read. Says the woman who writes letters to the newspaper every week, Griselda murmured under her breath. Miss Marple hid a smile. What exactly do you want to know, Lavinia? Griselda asked with just enough politeness to remain decent. Miss Fawcett folded her arms. Only that the entire village is talking about the break-in, and I don't intend to be left out. I should like to contribute useful information. About Mr. Bexley? Miss Marple prompted. Well, yes. I've seen him about, and I must say he behaves very strangely. He often receives letters, thicker envelopes than normal, and he leaves the cottage at odd hours. It might be nothing, but then again, one never knows. And have you any reason to think he has enemies? Miss Marple asked. Miss Fawcett's eyes gleamed. That was exactly the sort of question she liked. Well, she said confidentially, lowering her voice, there is the matter of his visitor. Visitor? Griselda echoed. Indeed. A woman arrived only yesterday afternoon, smartly dressed, strikingly so. I watched from my study window as she knocked. Mr. Bexley seemed quite unsettled by her appearance. Did you see her leave? Miss Marple asked. No, that is the odd part. I never saw her leave at all. Miss Marple and Griselda exchanged a glance. How very curious, Miss Marple murmured. Before Miss Fawcett could elaborate, a young man approached the gate, Christopher Sims, the village electrician. He was tall, sandy-haired, and had the relaxed, good-humored air of someone who made friends easily. Morning, ladies, he called cheerfully. Miss Marple, I heard what happened at Mr. Bexley's. Strange business. You know him? She asked. Everyone knows everyone in St. Mary Mead, he said with a grin. He had me in the other day to look at a faulty lamp. Odd chap, yes, but harmless. Seemed nervous, though. Kept asking whether his windows were secure. That is interesting, Miss Marple said. And when was this? Yesterday afternoon. Around 4, I'd say. Before or after the mysterious female visitor? Griselda asked. Visitor? Didn't see one, but I did see Hazel, the maid, coming from the shop with 2 parcels. She looked upset. Hazel, the trembling girl who had nearly cried over the spilled cordial. Miss Marple filed that away too. Christopher pushed his cap back. Anything I can do to help? Not at the moment, Miss Marple said kindly, but thank you. He departed with a friendly nod. Once he was out of sight, Miss Fawcett spoke again. I blame that new maid. The girl is flighty, always running about as though she's hiding something. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Sometimes, Miss Fawcett, people who appear to be hiding something are merely trying not to be late for work. Miss Fawcett huffed, offended, and marched away. As she disappeared down the lane, Griselda leaned toward Miss Marple. So far we have. A nervous writer, a mysterious visitor, a frightened maid, a staged break-in, a coded knitting square, and laudanum spilled conveniently where all might see. And a village more eager for intrigue than Sunday pudding, Miss Marple added with amusement. Griselda laughed. Well, what's your next step? Miss Marple rose, lifting her basket. I should like to speak to Hazel, and perhaps later to Mrs. Merton at Hillcrest Cottage. I suspect both young women may have noticed more than they realize. Griselda nodded. Be careful, Miss Marple. I always am. Miss Marple found Hazel Price near the back of the high street, standing beside the pump, drawing water into a tin pail. The girl was small, with dark curls that escaped her cap and eyes too large for her narrow face. She started visibly when she saw Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting— Don't be alarmed, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I wanted to see how you were after such a shocking morning. Hazel hesitated. Then, perhaps comforted by Miss Marple's warm, grandmotherly manner, she relaxed slightly. It was awful, miss, truly awful. I've never seen such a thing. Miss Marple folded her hands. Hazel, were you aware that the cordial contained laudanum? Hazel's eyes widened. No, never. I wouldn't go near the stuff. Mr. Bexley keeps it locked in a cabinet. I didn't even know he'd opened it. Miss Marple watched her closely. Has he been ill? No, nothing like that, but he has trouble sleeping. He reads strange books, you see. He says they give him ideas for his writing. Has he had any other visitors lately? Apart from the woman Miss Fawcett described. Hazel bit her lip. Miss Marple waited patiently. Then Hazel whispered, There was someone else, last week. A man. He didn't come inside, but he stood outside the gate. Mr. Bexley talked to him for a long time. They looked angry. And did you hear anything they said? Only the end. The man said, You can't hide it forever. And then he left. Miss Marple's brows lifted. Did Mr. Bexley seem frightened afterward? Hazel nodded solemnly. Very. And Hazel, Miss Marple added gently, is there something you're afraid of? Hazel's hands tightened on the pail. I can't say, miss, not yet, but please don't let anyone think I had anything to do with this morning. I would never harm Mr. Bexley. I don't believe you would, Hazel, Miss Marple said soothingly, but someone is trying to make matters appear quite dramatic, and that is seldom the work of innocent people. Hazel swallowed hard. I don't know who would want to frighten him. Miss Marple did. Or at least she was beginning to. Her final stop that afternoon was Hillcrest Cottage, recently rented by Mrs. Sylvia Merton. Miss Marple walked up the narrow gravel path, taking in the newly painted shutters and the vase of fresh tulips in the window. Mrs. Merton opened the door herself. She was a handsome woman in her early 30s with sleek auburn hair and a cheery smile that seemed just a touch too bright. Miss Marple. What an unexpected pleasure. I do hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I found something at Mr. Bexley's cottage this morning and wondered whether you might tell me if it looks familiar. She produced the knitted square. Mrs. Merton's smile froze. Why, whatever is that? A piece of knitting, Miss Marple said lightly. Most unusual. Mrs. Merton hesitated, just for a breath, but Miss Marple did not miss it. I'm afraid I've never seen anything quite like it. I knit only simple scarves. Of course, Miss Marple said. You've told us all that. Mrs. Merton blinked. May I ask, Miss Marple added softly, whether you know Mr. Bexley well? Well? Mrs. Merton repeated, just slightly too quickly. Not at all. Hardly at all. Why do you ask? No reason in particular, Miss Marple said with a mild smile. The village is merely aflutter with questions today. Mrs. Merton forced a laugh. How silly. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Quite silly. But her eyes said otherwise. When Miss Marple returned home to her tidy white cottage and brewed a quiet cup of tea, she placed the knitted square on the table beside her. Green and gold, a hidden signal, a staged crime scene, a frightened maid, a mysterious visitor, and several people lying, some boldly, some timidly. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. My, she murmured. The pattern is getting clearer. Chapter 3, Conversations in the Village Lane's morning sunlight spilled gently across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, a small wicker basket on her arm and a thoughtful crease on her brow. The air smelled faintly of dew and chimney smoke, the unmistakable fragrance of a village just coming to life. The discovery of Mrs. Weatherby's pattern problem the previous evening and the odd theft of her lace sampler still occupied Miss Marple's mind like an unfinished column of knitting. Patterns did not simply vanish. They unraveled for a reason. She walked along the lane toward the high street, lifting her skirts slightly to avoid a puddle. Though outwardly serene, her sharp eyes were alert for anyone who might shed light on the emerging mystery. St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of personalities, and Miss Marple knew each stitch intimately. She had not gone far before encountering Mr. Leonard Pritchard, the retired accountant, carefully trimming the hedge bordering his neat little gate. He was a fussy man with a long, narrow nose and spectacles perched precariously on the end of it. Numbers comforted him, people less so. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, pulling off his gloves. "Off to the shops?" "And a few inquiries," she replied with a pleasant smile. "Though I suppose that's rather obvious by the determined look on my face." He chuckled nervously. "These inquiries wouldn't happen to pertain to that unfortunate business at Mrs. Weatherby's?" "Indeed they would." "You haven't heard anything further, I suppose?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated, glancing at his hedge as though it might provide him with a suitable answer. "No, nothing at all, though." He cleared his throat. "I did notice someone hurrying down the lane last night, around 9:30. A bit late for foot traffic, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's brows lifted, though she kept her tone light. "Oh? And who might that have been?" "I'm not certain," he said quickly, almost defensively. "But the figure was carrying something. A parcel or a case, hard to tell in the dark." He replaced his spectacles and resumed trimming with unnecessary vigor. "Probably nothing of importance." Miss Marple thanked him and continued on, though the sighting did interest her. 9:30 was rather late for respectable errands, especially in a village where the day's gossip shut its doors by 6. At the high street, she turned toward Mrs. Ivy Longmore's bakery, its tiny window filled with warm, golden pastries. The bell jingled as she entered, and the plump baker looked up with a cheerful smile. "Miss Marple, fresh scones today, and I've set aside a batch of wholemeal biscuits I know you favor." "Very kind of you, Ivy. But I must trouble you with a different matter entirely." Mrs. Longmore wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. "Oh, I've been expecting you. Everyone's buzzing about Mrs. Weatherby's missing lace. You've come to sniff out the truth, I dare say." Miss Marple smiled at the imagery. "Only a small sniff. I wondered, did you see anyone peculiar about last night?" "Peculiar?" The baker frowned thoughtfully. "Well, I did see Miss Clara Linton rushing past the shop around 8 o'clock. Looked awfully flustered. She nearly collided with poor Mr. Finch and didn't even apologize." Miss Marple made a mental note. Clara Linton, the school teacher with a quiet, serious facade and a habit of walking swiftly as though chased by unspoken worries. "And did you notice where she was going?" "I assumed to the vicarage," Mrs. Longmore said, dusting her counter. "She often volunteers for evening reading sessions with the children." "Ah," Miss Marple said, touching her chin. "And yet 8 o'clock is a touch late for lessons." "Quite right." The baker leaned forward in a conspiratorial manner. Truth be told, she looked upset, like someone who had received a nasty letter or overheard cruel gossip. Miss Marple thanked her and purchased a small packet of biscuits, because one could never accuse her of entering a shop merely for information, and stepped back into the crisp morning air. Her next destination was the vicarage. The ivy-covered building stood with quiet dignity, its brass bell pull glinting faintly. Before Miss Marple could take hold of it, the door swung open, revealing Reverend Alfred Whitcomb, a tall, gentle-eyed man with a calmness that seemed woven into his very posture. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, "a pleasure as always. And mine, Reverend. I won't take much of your time. Did Miss Linton come by last night?" "Miss Linton?" He blinked. "Why, no. Not that I'm aware. We had our Wednesday prayer circle, of course, but she doesn't usually attend." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. So Clara had not gone to the vicarage after all. Another thread, loose and intriguing. "Everything all right?" Reverend Whitcomb asked. "You seem pensive." "A missing lace sampler," she replied simply, "and a few puzzling behaviors." The vicar sighed in mild exasperation. St. Mary Mead and its puzzles. I often wonder if the Almighty placed you here intentionally, Miss Marple, to keep the rest of us from coming entirely unraveled. She chuckled lightly, but her attention sharpened as she thanked him and left. Clara Linton's whereabouts between 8 and 9:30 were now a question mark, or perhaps an exclamation point. Miss Marple walked back toward the square when she encountered Mrs. Gwendolen Harrogate, a woman whose fashion sense exceeded her discretion. She was wrapped in a rather flamboyant emerald shawl and carried her shopping basket as though it were a royal scepter. "Oh, Miss Marple, I simply must speak with you," she said breathlessly. "Of course, dear. What seems to be the matter?" Mrs. Harrogate lowered her voice, but not her enthusiasm. "I saw Mr. Owen Marsh near the Weatherby cottage last evening. Quite near, in fact, lurking." Miss Marple kept her tone mild. "Lurking?" "Well, standing, really, but he looked terribly suspicious. Hands in his pockets, hat pulled low. It was most irregular." Miss Marple resisted the urge to inquire whether merely wearing a hat qualified as suspicious in Mrs. Harrogate's world, and instead said, "Did you speak to him?" "Heavens, no," I hurried on. "I'm not one for confrontation, but I know what I saw." Miss Marple thanked her gently, aware that Mrs. Harrogate's reports tended to contain equal parts truth and embellishment. Still, Owen Marsh, the solitary artist who lived at the edge of the village, was an interesting addition. Artists often noticed details others missed, and sometimes got themselves entangled in matters they ought not to. With several avenues now tugging at the hem of her curiosity, Miss Marple returned home. She sat by her small writing desk, took out a blank sheet of notepaper, and began listing the threads she had gathered. Chapter 4. Threads that don't quite fit. The next morning dawned gray and thoughtful, as though the sky itself were contemplating the puzzle unfolding in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat before her small hearth, knitting needles gently clicking while her mind sorted through the events of the previous day. There were threads, several of them, but none yet formed a pattern she could trust. Missing lace, distressed school teachers, vague figures in the night. It was all rather like a scarf knitted in the wrong order. One had to unpick a few rows to see where the mistake lay. She stood, set her knitting neatly aside, and fastened her sensible coat. Today she decided she would seek out Owen Marsh, the quiet artist whose name had crept into the rumor mill. It was not Miss Marple's habit to accuse, merely to observe, and observation was a skill she had perfected as naturally as other ladies perfected jam-making. Owen Marsh lived in a converted stable at the far end of the village, where the hedgerows grew thicker and bird song was more insistent. His front garden was charming in a decidedly disheveled way, filled with mismatched pots and bold splashes of wildflowers dancing in uneven rows. Miss Marple approached the door and knocked lightly. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Owen himself, tall, thin, with a smudge of paint in his dark hair and eyes that seemed to look both at her and through her. "Miss Marple," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "What can I do for you?" "I wondered," she began in her most pleasant tone, "if I might trouble you for a moment. It's regarding Mrs. Weatherby's unfortunate incident." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes, the missing lace." Miss Marple observed the reaction quietly. "You have heard of it, then?" "It's all over the village," he replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Mrs. Harrogate stopped me in the street and insisted upon giving me her theory, which included, rather dramatically, the possibility of a foreign spy." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "I don't suppose you're here to accuse me of espionage?" "Oh, goodness, no," Miss Marple said lightly, though she noted the defensive tone. "I simply wished to ask if you were near the Weatherby cottage last evening." Owen looked sharply toward her, then away. "I suppose Mrs. Harrogate told you that?" "She mentioned you were in the vicinity." He sighed, running a hand through his paint-speckled hair. "I was sketching the old elm tree by the lane. The light was fading and I wanted to capture the silhouette, that's all. Hardly a crime." "No one said it was," Miss Marple said with gentle reassurance. "But you might have seen something, or someone useful." Owen paused, then, reluctantly, "There was someone walking quickly toward the crossroads, carrying a case or box of some sort. I didn't recognize them in the dim light." Case?" Miss Marple repeated, recalling Mr. Pritchard's sighting. "Large, small, medium, I suppose. Like something you'd keep sewing tools in." He shrugged. "I thought it odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time." "Thank you," Miss Marple said sincerely. "That may prove quite helpful." Before she departed, she let her eyes drift around the studio. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, botanical studies, a still life of a lace collar rendered with remarkable precision. She wondered whether Owen's attention to delicate patterns contributed to his interest in the missing sampler, or whether his interest was merely artistic curiosity. Leaving the studio, Miss Marple made her way back toward the village center. Her next stop would be Miss Clara Linton, whose hurried flight and distressed expression had raised uncomfortable questions. The schoolteacher's cottage sat neatly among a row of tidy houses, each one trimmed with matching white shutters and small front gardens. Clara's curtains were drawn, though it was well past breakfast time. Miss Marple knocked, waited, then knocked again. At last the door opened a crack and Clara peered out, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had not slept well. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "is something wrong?" "Not wrong, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I wanted to know if you are feeling quite yourself. You seemed rather upset last night." Clara swallowed, glancing nervously up and down the street before allowing Miss Marple inside. The sitting room was immaculate, too immaculate, perhaps. Not a book out of place, not a cushion crooked, orderly to the point of discomfort. "I didn't want to speak about it," Clara said, wringing her hands. "I still don't really. But I suppose you already know I wasn't at the vicarage." "I do," Miss Marple admitted gently. "And I am not here to pry, but I am concerned." Clara hesitated, then sank into a chair. "I received a letter yesterday evening. It upset me terribly, a private matter." She looked away, her throat tightening. "I didn't steal anything, Miss Marple, I swear it." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "My dear child, I did not come suspecting you, only to understand." Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew a small slip of folded paper. I shouldn't show anyone, but perhaps you will know what to do." Miss Marple took the paper delicately and opened it. A single sentence was written inside in blocky, deliberate script. "You know what you did. It's time to pay for it." Miss Marple felt the faintest chill. Anonymous notes were rarely good news and often connected to unpleasant secrets. "Have you any idea who wrote this?" she asked quietly. Clara shook her head. "None at all. And I went to speak with Mrs. Weatherby yesterday to calm myself, but she wasn't home. I walked the lanes trying to clear my head, and by the time I returned, all this talk of the theft had begun." Miss Marple folded the paper and returned it. "Thank you for trusting me. You mustn't worry. I believe the truth will come to light very soon." Clara offered a small, trembling smile. Outside, Miss Marple paused. Between Owen's sighting, Clara's mysterious letter, and the nameless figure with the case, a shape was beginning to emerge, still blurred but present. As she walked home, she nearly collided with Inspector Graves, who tipped his hat with brisk politeness. "Morning, Miss Marple. Heard you've been poking about. Mind sharing what you found?" "Oh, just a few loose threads," she replied with pleasant ambiguity, "though I dare say they may knit themselves into something meaningful." The inspector gave her a sideways look, half amused, half wary. "You usually beat us to the punch. Try not to solve it before luncheon." Miss Marple only smiled. She couldn't promise him that. After all, the pattern was growing clearer by the hour. Chapter 5. A Pattern. Hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple woke on Saturday morning with a sense of forward motion, as though the mystery itself had nudged her awake and insisted she not waste a moment. A pale wash of sun lay across her bedroom curtains, promising a crisp day, ideal for visiting neighbors under the guise of sociable errands. Patterns, she reflected, were curious things. Sometimes they demanded one follow the threads outward, and sometimes the answer lay quietly tucked at the center. After breakfast, she set off toward the Weatherby cottage, deciding it was time to speak with Mildred Weatherby directly. The village's gossip wheel had spun almost uncontrollably since the lace sampler's disappearance, but Miss Marple preferred her facts unseasoned. Mrs. Weatherby opened the door with visible relief. Her round face, normally serene from years of lace-making and herbal teas, looked pinched with worry. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. I've been quite beside myself. Inspector Graves asked a few questions yesterday, but seemed more interested in whether I'd misplaced it than whether someone actually stole it." Miss Marple stepped into the cozy sitting room, noting the open sewing basket near the fireplace, the half-finished handkerchief, and, tellingly, the empty spot on the mantel where the sampler had once been displayed. "I assure you, Mildred, it was no simple misplacement," Miss Marple said gently, "and I hoped perhaps you might recall anything, no matter how small on the surface, that occurred in the day or two before it vanished." Mrs. Weatherby wrung her hands. "Well, I did have visitors. More than usual, oddly enough." Miss Marple's brows rose just a fraction. "Visitors?" "Yes. On Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Leonard Pritchard came by asking for help repairing a small tear in his cuff. Quite unusual, since he generally prefers everything done professionally." She mimicked his prim tone with unintended accuracy. "And then, later that same day, Clara Linton stopped in. She said she wished to borrow a gardening book I once mentioned. But she barely stayed a minute." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Owen Marsh?" Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Why, no. Owen hasn't visited in ages, though I did catch sight of him near my hedge around dusk yesterday. He waved, but I was inside preparing supper." The pieces were shifting, but not yet clicking into place. Miss Marple took a slow turn about the room. Her attention lingered on a wooden stand beside the window, where several pieces of lace were pinned for drying or display. Fine patterns, Flowers, leaves, delicate looping curves covered the fabric squares like whispers stitched into cloth. She leaned in. "This one is new, isn't it?" Mrs. Weatherby smiled faintly. "Yes, I started it 3 days ago. A gift for my niece's birthday." Miss Marple traced the air above it with her finger. "Very pretty. The motif almost resembles the border of your missing sampler." "Yes, same style," Mrs. Weatherby said. "Hardly anyone but me uses that particular looping stitch anymore." "Hardly anyone," Miss Marple repeated softly, storing that away. After leaving the cottage, she walked toward the village square at a brisker pace than usual. She needed to consider her next interview carefully. Each suspect possessed a motive of some degree, Mr. Pritchard with his strange late-night observations and convenient visit, Clara Linton with her secretive distress, Owen Marsh with his proximity and artistic fixation on lace-like patterns. But there was someone she had not spoken to yet, a person who, though not mentioned directly, often sat at the center of St. Mary Mead's quiet whirlpool of wagging tongues. Mrs. Gwendolen Harrogate. The woman's flamboyant shawl was visible from half a street away, which Miss Marple found somewhat reassuring. Some people broadcast their intentions without meaning to. Mrs. Harrogate broadcast everything. "Miss Marple," the woman exclaimed as she approached, "I have simply so much to tell you. The village is in uproar. I hear Inspector Graves suspects a group of outsiders passing through on bicycles." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Oh, how imaginative. But I wonder, Mrs. Harrogate, if you might help me with something far more grounded. You see, I'm trying to recreate the movements of the villagers on Wednesday and Thursday. Purely for clarity, of course." "Of course," Mrs. Harrogate said, instantly flattered. "Ask anything. Did you happen to see Clara Linton on Wednesday afternoon?" "Oh, yes. She walked past my cottage in quite a hurry, carrying a little parcel. Brown paper, string, looked like a gift perhaps, though she didn't stop to chat." Mrs. Harrogate sniffed, which was a touch rude, if I may say so. "And Mr. Pritchard?" "He came by wearing a very agitated expression," she said in a lower voice. "He asked if I had noticed any strangers in the lanes, yet he himself looked as though he were hiding something." Miss Marple thanked her, suppressing a small sigh. Mrs. Harrogate's interpretations were rarely reliable, but even exaggerated gossip could contain grains of truth. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had returned home, where she laid out her notes on the kitchen table. The facts arranged themselves like pieces of lace pinned to a frame. She tapped her fingers lightly. Something in the repetition of that pattern nagged at her. The looping stitch, the distinctive weaving, the way it demanded both skill and familiarity. A pattern rarely appears in only one place. Suddenly she rose, a spark of realization lighting her eyes, and hurried to her back garden. There she lifted a small ceramic bird feeder and withdrew a bundle of folded cloth she had stored earlier, a scrap she had collected from Owen Marsh's garden hedge during her walk the previous week, when she'd noticed it fluttering oddly. She had assumed it fallen from a washing line. Not anymore. She opened it. A tiny section of lace, unfinished but unmistakably using Mrs. Weatherby's signature looping stitch. Miss Marple stood very still, her mind arranging the final deductions. Someone besides Mildred Weatherby had mastered that stitch. Someone who had been practicing. Someone who had a reason to take the pattern that revealed her secret. The threads were aligning at last. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin tugging at them, carefully, methodically, until the whole truth unraveled perfectly. The pattern had been there all along. Miss Marple simply needed to follow it. Chapter 6. The chamber beneath the manor. A thunderous crack split the night as lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the manor in ghostly flashes. The storm had grown violent, licking the eaves with rain and rattling the window panes like restless fingers. Evelyn stood in the corridor outside the library, breath trembling as she held the ancient brass key she had taken from the detective's coat pocket. She shouldn't have taken it, she knew. But something inside her whispered that waiting for Arthur's pace would mean losing precious answers. She slipped through the shadows, her footsteps muffled on the thick wine-red carpet. The key trembled slightly in her fingers as she approached the east wing, the abandoned section of Marshwood Manor that even the staff avoided after dusk. Rumors had long swirled, strange noises, cold drafts, fleeting silhouettes. Some said the manor had been built atop something far older than its documented history. Evelyn had always dismissed these tales as superstition, until tonight. The air grew colder as she reached the final door in the hall. Unlike the others, its wood was darker, older, as though it predated the rest of the manor entirely. She slid the key into the lock. A heavy click echoed through the corridor. The door swung inward, with a soft groan. The chamber beyond was pitch black. Evelyn struck a match and the flame blossomed to life, casting trembling shadows on the walls. The room was empty, except for a steep stone staircase spiraling downward into the earth. Her stomach tightened. The manor had no basement, at least none that appeared on any blueprint, but this was why she was here. She descended step by cautious step, the scent of damp stone thickening as she went deeper. The air felt heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed for decades. When her match finally died, plunging her into darkness, she fumbled for another, but before she could strike it, she heard it. A whisper. At first she thought it was the wind funneling through cracks, but then it came again. Soft, deliberate, almost human. Her heart lurched. She struck the match with shaking hands. The faint light revealed a vast underground chamber, circular and lined with thick stone pillars. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, spirals, interlocking shapes, and a sigil she recognized from the pages of Arthur's secret notebook. The same sigil appeared in the photograph found in Harold's drawer, a symbol of a secret society Arthur had been investigating in silence, the Order of the Ebon Crescent. Evelyn's pulse raced. This place, this room, was the heart of that mystery. As she stepped further, her matchlight reflected off something metallic. She moved closer, only to freeze. There was a table in the center of the chamber, and on that table, Harold's pocket watch. She gasped. She had seen Detective Arthur slip it into his coat earlier. What was it doing down here? Before she could reach out, the door slammed shut above, sending a booming echo through the chamber. Evelyn whipped around, footsteps, measured, slow, descending. Her heart pounded as the glow of a lantern emerged from the top of the stairs, and a silhouette followed, tall, rigid, unmistakable. Detective Arthur. But something was wrong. His face, lit by the lantern's flickering flame, held no trace of his usual calm intellect. Instead, his expression was carved in cold focus, eyes unreadable. "Evelyn," he said, voice echoing off the stone. "You shouldn't have come here." She backed away as he reached the bottom step. "You lied," she said, the words cracking. "You knew about this room. You've known for a long time." Arthur exhaled slowly, setting down the lantern. "You weren't meant to see this." "So it's true then? You're part of the Order?" A long silence stretched between them, heavy enough to crush the air. Arthur stepped closer. "Part of it? No. I've been fighting to expose it for years." Evelyn's breath hitched. "Then why hide this from me?" "Because people who get close to the Order disappear." His eyes softened briefly. "I didn't want you to be one of them." Before she could speak, a faint metallic clatter echoed from behind the pillars. "Evelyn," stiffened. Arthur's expression sharpened instantly. He picked up the lantern, stepping in front of her as if shielding her from something unseen. "We're not alone," he whispered. The air shifted. A cold draft swept through the chamber, extinguishing Evelyn's match. The lantern sputtered but managed to hold its flame. Then a shadow moved. Not the kind cast by light, something thicker, sliding between pillars with deliberate grace. Evelyn gripped Arthur's sleeve. "What is that?" "Not what," Arthur murmured. "Who?" A figure stepped into the lantern's glow, face hidden beneath a deep hood. But Evelyn could see, barely, a glint of something metallic around their neck. The same sigil, the same crescent. The intruder raised a hand, holding a thin silver blade that caught the lantern light. Arthur pushed Evelyn behind him. "Run when I say," he whispered. The figure lunged. Arthur met them halfway, grabbing the attacker's wrist. The blade clattered to the floor and skittered across the stone. The fight was quick and brutal, shadows twisting violently across the chamber. Evelyn stumbled backward, her breath trapped somewhere in her chest. Just as Arthur gained the upper hand, the hooded intruder slammed something against the ground. A flash bomb. A burst of white light swallowed the room. Evelyn cried out, shielding her eyes. When the brightness died and the chamber cleared, the intruder was gone. All that remained was a smear of blood and the echo of footsteps retreating into the depths. Arthur cursed under his breath. "We have to leave now. They'll bring others." Evelyn stared at him, still shaken. What were they doing here? Arthur paused, breathing hard, gaze flicking toward the pocket watch on the table. They were finishing what was started the night Harold died. Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Then who killed him?" Arthur looked at her with a heaviness she had never seen before. "That," he said quietly, "is what we must uncover before they silence us both." He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the stairs as thunder cracked overhead, and the chamber plunged into trembling darkness. Chapter 7. The mask behind the smile. The manor had never felt so alive, and not in a comforting way. As Evelyn and Arthur emerged from the hidden stairway back into the East Wing corridor, the storm outside roared with renewed fury, rattling the old window frames as if urging them to flee. The walls seemed to pulse with echoes of what they had just witnessed beneath the manor. The sigils, the symbols, the masked intruder, everything clung to Evelyn's thoughts like cobwebs, tugging at her nerves with every step. Arthur locked the hidden door behind them, wiping sweat and dust from his brow. He didn't speak. Not yet. He was listening, every muscle taut, every sense sharpened. Evelyn thought he looked less like a detective and more like a cornered soldier preparing for another ambush. Only when they reached the safety of the brighter hallway did he finally exhale. "We have limited time," he murmured. "The order operates like a hive. If one member fails, others follow." Evelyn swallowed hard. Why Harold? What did he know that got him killed? Arthur's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he guided her into the drawing room, shutting the door behind them. The fire in the hearth had died to glowing embers, casting the room in warm, quivering shades of orange. "Sit," he said gently. "I owe you the truth before we take another step." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Yes, you do." Arthur remained standing, his silhouette tall and somber against the flickering light. "Harold Marsh wasn't just the head of the manor," he began slowly. "He was once my partner, years ago." She blinked. "Your partner? As in, your policing days?" Arthur nodded. Before he married into the Marshwood fortune, Harold was part of an independent investigative group. We were trying to expose a secret society embedded in political and business circles, the same order whose chamber we just discovered. Evelyn felt a coldness creep up her spine. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I couldn't risk it, Arthur said. Not until I knew whose side you were on. Her breath caught. You thought I could be part of this? I had to consider every possibility, he said softly. The Order has been known to recruit family members, friends, even lovers. Evelyn's cheeks warmed involuntarily, though confusion clouded her thoughts. So Harold remained involved? Arthur hesitated, then shook his head. He left the group, tried to reform his life, but he discovered something that put him in danger, and he reached out to me a week before his death. The revelation struck Evelyn like a blow, her uncle, whom she remembered as stern but kind, keeping such secrets. It didn't fit with the man she knew. Yet the evidence beneath the manor said otherwise. What did he find? She whispered. Arthur reached into his inner pocket and retrieved a folded piece of worn paper. Evelyn's heart quickened as he opened it and set it on the table between them. It was a list, names, initials, symbols marking some, crossing out others. One name was circled twice, Lydia Marsh. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. My aunt. Arthur's gaze bore into hers. Harold believed she had ties to the Order. It seems he suspected she'd resumed activity with them. Evelyn's throat tightened. No, Lydia wouldn't. She couldn't. Lightning illuminated the room in a violent flash, and for an instant the shadows on the wall resembled twisted silhouettes like cloaked figures lurking in the corners. Arthur placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'm not saying she killed him, but Harold feared she was being used or manipulated. The Order preys on weaknesses, loneliness, ambition, fear. Before Evelyn could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall, hurried, uneven. Both turned sharply. The door burst open and Lydia stood there, pale, soaked from the storm, her shawl hanging loosely around her trembling frame. Her eyes were red, swollen, panic-stricken. Evelyn, she whispered, breathless, I need you. Arthur tensed immediately, stepping subtly in front of Evelyn. Lydia's gaze flicked to him, her hands quivering. You, she said, voice cracking. You're the one stirring all this trouble. Leave us, leave my home. Arthur stayed silent. Evelyn stood. Aunt Lydia, what's wrong? Lydia staggered toward her, clutching Evelyn's hands tightly. They're watching me, she whispered, shaking. I saw a man outside the window, a man in a hood. He was standing by the old oak, staring right at my room. Arthur exchanged a sharp glance with Evelyn. Lydia continued, voice trembling. He said something I couldn't hear, but it felt like Harold's death wasn't the end, like more was coming. Her words slurred slightly. Her breaths were uneven. Arthur moved closer, eyes narrowing. Mrs. Marsh, he said gently, did you take anything tonight? Anything at all? Medication, tea, pills? Lydia jerked her hands back defensively. How dare you? I'm not mad. I know what I saw. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her aunt. No one is saying you're mad. We believe you. Arthur crouched near Lydia, his voice low. Where did you go tonight? You're drenched. Lydia looked away. I had to see someone. Who? Arthur pressed. She didn't answer. Her hands tightened around Evelyn's sleeve as if clinging to a lifeline. Thunder boomed outside again, long, rumbling, almost like a growl. Then from the hallway beyond the door, something slammed, a heavy object falling. Arthur rose instantly. Stay here, he ordered, then slipped into the corridor. Evelyn held Lydia close as the older woman trembled uncontrollably. Moments passed. Too many. Then Arthur's voice called out, tense, sharp. Evelyn, come, carefully. She escorted Lydia to the doorway, afraid of what she might find. In the hallway, a vase lay shattered on the floor. Rain had blown in from an open window, the same one that faced the old oak tree Lydia mentioned. But that wasn't what made Evelyn's breath stop. On the windowsill rested a small folded piece of paper weighed down by a pebble. Arthur handed it to her, his expression grim. Evelyn unfolded it with trembling fingers. A single symbol was drawn in black ink, the crescent. Below it 3 words. "We are near." Evelyn's heart hammered. Lydia swayed, nearly fainting. Arthur stared into the stormy darkness outside, jaw clenched. "The Order knows we found the chamber," he said quietly. He turned to Evelyn. "And they're done hiding." Chapter 8. Threads tighten in the dark. The storm carried on with relentless force, shaking Marshwood Manor as though nature itself sensed the tightening noose of danger. After Arthur secured the open window and ensured Lydia was safely resting in her room, with Evelyn by her side for comfort, he summoned Evelyn to the library. She arrived moments later, still pale, still shaken, yet determined. He stood at the large oak table, maps, notes, and Harold's lists spread before him like the scattered pieces of an unsolved puzzle. Evelyn closed the door quietly behind her. "Is Lydia safe?" she asked. Arthur nodded. "For the moment. I've locked her door from the inside and blocked the adjoining hallway, but if the Order wants to reach her, locks won't matter." Evelyn winced. "She's terrified, Arthur, truly terrified. I've never seen her like that, not even after Harold died." "Fear," he replied, "is exactly what the Order uses to control people. And Lydia may know more than she admits." Evelyn stepped closer to the table, her eyes drawn to the list again. "You think she's involved." "I think she's entangled," Arthur said softly. "Whether willingly or not, that remains unclear." He lifted one of Harold's letters, his brow furrowing. Before he died, Harold wrote that he'd discovered a pattern, something woven into the daily life of the manor. Something so ordinary that no one would notice unless they were looking. Evelyn frowned. "A pattern? Of what?" "Information," Arthur murmured. "Messages, signals, routes." He tapped the list. "I didn't see it before, but the Order calls itself a circle of continuity, all cycles, repetitions, and patterns." Lightning flashed, illuminating the rows of book spines around them. Evelyn leaned forward. "Then we need to find the pattern he saw." Arthur nodded. "And quickly." The symbol left at the window wasn't meant as a threat alone. It was a warning. They're accelerating whatever they planned. He handed her Harold's pocket diary. Page 33. She flipped to the marked page. Harold's neat handwriting filled a half-dozen lines, cryptic and compressed. 3 lights from the west window. 2 chords on the piano, a broken vase always replaced. The same cup of tea at 8. Repeating paths, repeating choices, the pattern is alive. Evelyn blinked. "This is nonsense!" Arthur shook his head. "Look closer. Harold wasn't losing his mind. He was documenting signals, behaviors, rituals." "But by whom?" "By someone in this manor," Arthur said. "Someone repeating a sequence over and over to communicate." Evelyn's thoughts raced. "Lydia has her morning tea at 8. "Yes. And the staff always replace the vase in the east corridor, no matter how many times it breaks." "Mrs. Grant," Evelyn said. "She fusses about that corridor endlessly." "And the piano," Arthur added. "Someone has been playing the same 2 notes at odd hours." "Tom, the houseboy," Evelyn whispered. "He always fiddles with it in the evening." Arthur looked up sharply. "You see it, don't you?" Evelyn's pulse quickened. "They're all suspects." A silence settled over the library, heavy as velvet. Arthur pointed to the diary again. "Harold said the pattern is alive, meaning it changes, adapts." "A living pattern," Evelyn murmured. "Someone directing all the others?" Arthur exhaled. "Possibly. The Order always has a conductor, someone who doesn't act but instructs." From the shadows. Before Evelyn could respond, the manor suddenly fell into silence. Not a comforting silence. an alarming one. The storm's roar dulled, the wind seemed to retreat, and beneath it something else took shape, the faint, unmistakable echo of footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Evelyn froze. Arthur silently motioned her behind the desk, where she crouched, heartbeat thundering in her ears. He extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into shadow, and moved toward the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. The footsteps paused outside. A soft metallic sound followed, as though someone were sliding a thin object under the door. Arthur acted instantly. He yanked the door open. The corridor was empty. Rain battered the windows once more, the storm returning with renewed ferocity, as if masking the intruder's escape. Arthur scanned the hallway, every sense alert. No movement, no figure, nothing but the long stretch of carpet and flickering sconces. He looked down. A small envelope lay at his feet, white, hand-folded, sealed with a crude wax mark, the crescent symbol again. Evelyn emerged from behind the desk, hesitant. "Arthur, what is it?" He handed her the envelope. It was slipped under the door. Her breath trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the note. This time there was no symbol, just a line of text in sharp, hurried handwriting. "The key is in what you hear. The pattern is broken. Someone fears you know." Evelyn looked up at Arthur, fear widening her eyes. "Someone inside the order is helping us." Arthur nodded slowly. "A traitor in the shadows, risking everything." "Why?" she whispered. Arthur's expression hardened. "Because the order is fracturing, and when a secret society cracks from within, it becomes twice as dangerous." He folded the note, slipping it into his coat. "From this moment forward, Evelyn, trust no action and no routine. If Harold was right, the pattern isn't just a clue, it's a battleground." Thunder crashed, and for the first time Evelyn understood. They weren't unraveling a mystery anymore. They were stepping directly into a war of hidden signals, and one wrong move could shatter everything. Chapter 9. The pattern reveals its master. The storm receded as dawn approached, leaving the manor wrapped in an eerie, water-soaked stillness. Marshwood Manor, usually humming in the early audited hours with servants bustling and kettles boiling, remained motionless. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. Arthur and Evelyn had spent most of the night poring over Harold's diary, tracing every line, every cryptic clue, until exhaustion pushed them into a rare moment of stillness in the library. But the quiet did nothing to calm Evelyn's nerves. Her thoughts were a tangle. Lydia's panic, the note from their hidden ally, the living pattern Harold had warned about. Arthur stood at the window overlooking the eastern lawns. "The storm has stopped," he murmured. "That means they'll move soon." "They?" Evelyn asked. "The order," Arthur replied. "They prefer action under chaos, but now that everything is clear..." He turned. "They'll come to finish what they started." Evelyn hugged her arms tightly. "Arthur, we still don't know who the conductor is. The one behind the pattern." Arthur stepped toward her, placing Harold's diary on the table between them. He tapped 3 of Harold's entries, 3 lights from the west window, 2 chords on the piano, the vase replaced each day. "Individually," he said, "they're insignificant, but together they create timing, a schedule." Evelyn's eyes widened. "A code." Arthur nodded. "And whoever coordinated these signals had to be someone with authority over the house staff. Someone who could order routines, plant habits, alter schedules without raising suspicion." Evelyn blinked. "Mrs. Grant?" "She had control," Arthur conceded, "but not motive, and Harold didn't fear her." Evelyn hesitated. "Lydia?" Arthur shook his head. "She's frightened, not dangerous." "Then who?" A soft creak echoed through the hallway. Arthur stiffened instantly. Evelyn followed him to the door. When he pulled it open, a shadowed figure stood at the far end of the corridor. Lydia, but she looked different now, collected, calm, her fear replaced by a cold resolve. "Aunt Lydia," Evelyn whispered. Lydia stepped forward slowly. "Evelyn, dear." "Arthur." Her voice was steady, too steady. "There are things you should not have found." Arthur positioned himself subtly between them. "Where did you go last night, Lydia?" She smiled faintly. "To the tree. To think. To remember." Then she added, "Harold used to meet me there long before you knew of your uncle's secrets." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "You were part of the order." Lydia stopped in front of them. "Not by choice. Harold needed someone to stay close, to watch from within. He trusted me, and I trusted him." Evelyn gasped softly. "But if you were helping—" "I wasn't the only one," Lydia said. "Others in the manor were involved. To keep Harold safe, to help him end the order once and for all." Evelyn's hands trembled. "Then why didn't you tell us sooner?" Lydia's expression hardened. "Because the conductor is someone neither of you would suspect. Someone you still won't." Before Evelyn could speak, another voice sliced through the hallway. "That's quite enough, Lydia." They turned. Tom, the young houseboy, stepped forward from the staircase landing, his posture no longer timid or hunched but upright, calculating. His eyes gleamed with unsettling confidence. Evelyn froze. "Tom?" Arthur instinctively moved closer to her. "Tom, at your age, you're hardly a mastermind." Tom chuckled, calm, deliberate. "Age means nothing when everyone overlooks you, when everyone treats you like furniture." Lydia's voice trembled with rage. "Tom, stop this. Harold trusted you." "And that," Tom said coldly, "was his mistake." He descended the remaining steps with slow, measured steps. "You see," he continued, "Harold discovered that the Order's true leader had been replaced, betrayed, and he believed that leader was me." Evelyn's breath caught. "But you're just—" Tom shook his head. "Just a servant? A boy who sweeps and carries trays? That's exactly why I was perfect." He smirked. "The perfect observer, the perfect messenger, the perfect conductor." Arthur's voice dropped to steel. "And you killed Harold." Tom lifted his chin proudly. "He forced my hand. He said he would expose me, but the Order, what remains of it, needed someone with vision, someone untouched by the old rules." Lydia stepped forward. "You twisted everything he worked for. The Order was dead." "No," Tom replied calmly. "It needed to be reborn, stronger, smarter." Arthur clenched his fists. "So the signals, the lights, the cords, the vase—" "All me," Tom said, pleased with himself. "Small instructions to those who remained loyal. They followed because they believed I had Harold's approval." Evelyn's voice quivered. "You manipulated them." Tom's smile widened darkly. "I orchestrated them. Patterns are powerful things, Evelyn. People obey rhythms without even knowing it." Arthur moved subtly, placing himself fully between Tom and the women. "It ends now." Tom reached into his coat. Arthur tensed, bracing to strike. But Tom didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small brass whistle. "The traitor among us has ruined the pattern," Tom said. "But the Order still listens to me. One signal, and they'll come." Arthur shot forward, but Tom was faster. He raised the whistle to his lips. A loud crash erupted behind him. A vase, one of the many Lydia obsessively replaced, shattered over Tom's head. He collapsed instantly, unconscious. Lydia stood behind him, trembling, the broken ceramic in her hand. "I'm tired of the pattern," she whispered. Arthur rushed forward and secured Tom's hands with a curtain cord. Evelyn exhaled shakily, tears threatening to spill. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over. The conductor has fallen. Lydia let the ceramic drop, her voice weak but relieved. Harold, we did it. Evelyn looked at Tom, at the boy who had manipulated an entire household with quiet footsteps and repeating routines. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Final Revelations. The morning sun streamed gently through the lace-curtained windows of Marshwood Manor, turning the once ominous halls into a warm, golden sanctuary. The storm had passed, leaving the gardens glistening with raindrops and the air rich with the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. Inside, the manor felt almost ordinary again, though the memory of the past night's events lingered like shadows in the corners. Evelyn set the table for morning tea, arranging the delicate china cups with care while Lydia moved about the kitchen, tidying up with a nervous but purposeful energy. Even Tom, now quietly seated and subdued after the previous night's revelations, observed from a corner, still uncertain of his place in the household. Arthur entered, still in his coat, though the storm had passed hours ago. His expression had softened from the tension of the last few days, though his eyes remained alert. "Good morning," he said, voice steady. "I trust you slept a little after last night's chaos?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "As much as one can sleep with a hidden chamber beneath the manor and a former conductor lying in the hallway." She poured the tea, the rich aroma filling the air and creating a sense of normalcy that was almost comforting. Lydia brought over a plate of freshly baked scones. "It's strange," she said, setting them down carefully, "to think that we've been living under the influence of something so hidden, so pervasive, and never realizing it." Arthur nodded, accepting a cup of tea. "That's the nature of patterns, Mrs. Marsh. They can be invisible until someone notices the rhythm and realizes that what seems ordinary has been orchestrated." Evelyn took her seat, studying her aunt and Arthur in the soft morning light. "So everything, the vase, the piano, the lights, was Tom's doing?" "Yes," Arthur confirmed. "He was meticulous. He observed, manipulated, and exploited the habits of everyone in the manor to maintain the illusion of the order's continued presence. It was clever, if morally reprehensible." Lydia stirred her tea, her fingers trembling slightly. "Harold knew this would happen," she murmured. "He left clues, small, cryptic reminders of what was really going on, so that when the time came, someone would be able to see through the pattern." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "And you, Arthur, you pieced it together." Arthur smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and relief. "It was Harold's work more than mine. His observations were precise. The signs were all there. It only took someone paying attention to notice them. The patterns, once recognized, reveal their creator. And in this case, the creator of the chaos was evident once we understood the repetition." Tom, still seated quietly, looked down at the table. "I thought I could control it all," he said softly, almost to himself. "I didn't realize that the more you try to manipulate, the easier it is for the observant to catch the pattern." His voice carried a trace of grudging respect for the detective's skill. Evelyn reached out and placed a hand over his. "It's fortunate that no one was seriously hurt. That's what matters. Now you have a chance to make amends." Tom nodded slowly, the weight of his actions clearly settling in. He would have to face the consequences, but for now, there was a sense of calm, an easing of the tension that had gripped the manor for so long. Arthur looked around the table at the three of them. It's important to recognize that the mystery wasn't just about a pattern or a missing item. It was about human motives, weaknesses, and the consequences of secrecy. Harold's death was tragic, but through careful observation and reason, we were able to prevent further harm. Lydia set down her teacup with a faint sigh. "I suppose we can finally breathe. The house doesn't feel so oppressive anymore." She looked out the window at the sunlight glinting on the wet garden paths. The storm may have passed, but the lessons remain. Vigilance, attention to detail, and the willingness to observe the small things. Those are what kept us safe. Evelyn smiled, feeling a warm sense of closure. And the pattern itself. It's a reminder that nothing is truly random. Every action, no matter how small, leaves a trace. If you pay attention, you can uncover the truth. Arthur leaned back in his chair, lifting his cup of tea in a quiet toast. To observation, to reason, and to seeing through the patterns that others overlook. Evelyn raised her cup in return, a small smile tugging at her lips. To the quiet detectives in the world, those who notice what others dismiss. Lydia clinked her cup softly against theirs, the sound light and cheerful, filling the room with a sense of harmony. And to Harold, she added softly, her voice carrying a reverence that made Evelyn and Arthur pause, for leaving us the guidance we needed to see the truth. The three of them sat in companionable silence, sipping their tea as the sunlight grew warmer, illuminating the manor in a glow that felt both restorative and permanent. Outside, the garden sparkled, droplets clinging to petals and leaves, nature reclaiming the calm that had been so violently disrupted. Arthur finally spoke, voice calm but firm. With Tom's confession and the pattern fully understood, the immediate danger has passed. We'll ensure he is held accountable, but the manor itself is safe. The Order's influence here has ended. Evelyn set down her cup. And the villagers will be safe too. No more shadows or hidden signals to manipulate them. Lydia nodded, her expression softening into relief. Thank you both for seeing the truth, for protecting everyone, and for understanding that not all patterns are visible at first glance. Some need patience and careful attention to reveal themselves. Arthur smiled slightly. That, Mrs. Marsh, is the essence of investigation. And sometimes the most important mysteries are not just about the crime, they are about understanding the human heart and the choices people make. Evelyn looked at her aunt and Arthur, a sense of calm settling over her. The manor had endured a storm, both literal and metaphorical. But now the sun had returned, casting light over every shadow. And for the first time in days, she felt a true sense of peace. As the three of them finished their tea, Lydia finally allowed herself a soft laugh, a sound unburdened by fear. Evelyn joined her, and even Arthur's lips curved in a subtle smile. The storm had passed, the mysteries were solved, and the manor, with all its hidden chambers and cryptic patterns, was at last at rest. Evelyn stood and moved to the window, looking out over the gardens sparkling with morning light. She felt a gentle reassurance in the warmth of the sun and the quiet murmur of the village beyond. The mystery had been solved, but the lessons lingered. Vigilance, observation, and kindness could unravel even the most carefully hidden patterns. Turning back to the table, she raised her cup one last time. To a new day, and to seeing clearly no matter how complicated the patterns around us. Arthur and Lydia echoed her sentiments softly, and together they allowed the simple comfort of morning tea to mark the peaceful resolution of a mystery that had tested every skill, every intuition, and every heart involved. The manor, bathed in sunlight and renewed calm, seemed almost to sigh in relief, the echoes of the past finally settling into silence. And in that quiet warmth, the promise of ordinary days, where patterns were noticed but no longer feared, welcomed them all.